Okay, welcome. Today we are going to be talking about what to look out for. Uh, what to look out for during your property inspection. But before I before I begin, let me I guess say a few things. So very short, maybe 3 or 4 minute monologue. I'd like you to think about just before we begin. I'd like you to think about the concept of a life cycle. Think about the concept of a life cycle. A life cycle. Um, and I think this concept is something that is easy to appreciate when thinking about human beings. Human beings are born. They go through a very interesting phase of growth, rapid growth. They get to a stage of mature growth. They get to a point of stable growth. They become mature, and then eventually we get old and we die. Buildings also have a life cycle. And in thinking about your property inspection, I'd like you to keep the life cycle concept in mind. Buildings, like human beings, go through a life cycle, though a different life cycle. Buildings are constructed. So if you think about the life cycle of a building, they depreciate through use, they deteriorate, and they dilapidate. Now, the whole idea of dilapidation occurs in the absence of maintenance. So a building does not have to dilapidate. That is the choice. Now, despite this, the useful life of a building, because what we're looking at here is the lifetime and the life cycle of a building. The useful life of a building is not fixed. So it's not something that just stops. It doesn't, the building is not constructed and depreciates and dilapidates and deteriorates and then that's the end. The lifetime of a building depends on the choices that the owners and the building users make. And the key thing to keep in mind is that some buildings deteriorate fast and much quickly, whilst others can last 100 years. Now, you've heard me make reference to the concept of period buildings in Great Britain. These are buildings, and you can go back 200, 300, 400, 500 years, 600 years, and the buildings are still in use. One of the reasons the buildings are in use is because they have been maintained. Now, let me bring this back to your inspection and the concept of today's theme, which is what to look out for. One of the main aims of your viewing is to ascertain what stage the building is in its life cycle. So you're trying to understand, where is the building in this phase, and has this been extended? One way to do that is through your visual inspection. The visual inspection and what you look out for will throw some light on a few things. I mentioned in the previous session the condition of the building, the amount of capital expenditure that needs to be invested to offset the depreciation. So if you want to slow down the depreciation of a building, then you have to reinvest in the building. We call that capital expenditure. If you invest in the building, then it slows down the aging process. Another thing your inspection is meant to do is help you identify what type of depreciation the building has been exposed to, whether that's economic, functional, or physical. Economic has to do with the demand supply of that type of building, whether there is demand for such buildings. So for example, medieval buildings are not really in high demand in the UK, despite the fact that some of them are still available. Such buildings are usually used as tourist or places of interest. Functional depreciation has to do with, for example, a building that was constructed maybe 200 years ago, and some of the internal parts of the building, for example, what would have been originally the toilet, if you think about Victorian buildings, the function no longer serves a purpose in today's climate. And then the physical depreciation would have to do with the age. That would have to do with, the chimneys are quite old. They need to be repointed. The roof needs to be replaced. That's physical depreciation. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So during your building inspection, I would say that your most important role should be that of a detective. Think of yourself like Sherlock Holmes. You're there to identify and observe. You do not need a lot of technical experience. All you really need is common sense. You need common sense. I would say you need three things when you're inspecting. So what to look out for? You need three things. You need common sense. You need a level of detailed observation. And you need to have a pleasing personality. You need to have a disarming demeanor, just so that you can obtain more information. A pleasing personality has to do with the fact that you might be interacting with people who live in the same building or people who live adjacent to the property. And so sometimes you'll be stunned at how much a neighbor next door, how much wealth of information a neighbor has. They may have lived in the property in the adjacent property for say 40 years. And just being pleasant can open doors of obtaining more information. So keep that in mind. Now with that information, the question is, when you arrive, what do you do? And that would be what I'll focus on in the next few minutes. Now, upon arrival, here is my recommendation. Stand in front of the building and just look at the building. Look at the building as you would a beautiful piece of artwork. Just admire the building. But in addition to admiring the building, observe. Ask yourself the question, what am I seeing and what can I not see? Interest, curiosity, observation usually will guide you. You don't have to think too much about, this is not complicated stuff. This is simple. The same way if you were going on a date and you sat down in front of someone, you would be observing for the features, the texture of their skin, the color of their eyes, their eyebrows, their teeth, their smile. So just observe and just make a note of what you see. As I mentioned in the prior sessions, you should try to spend at least 30 minutes on the exterior and then another 30 minutes on the interior. Certainly, this all depends on the size of the building and also depends on the available time that has been provided by the agent or by the seller. Now, capture your initial impressions in a pad. You have to write things down. Never trust your memory. A blunt pencil is always better than the sharpest mind. Don't trust your memory. Now, the first area of focus should be the intrinsic value. Forgive me. The first area of focus should be the intrinsic beauty or ugliness of the building. Now let me say that again. Your first area of focus should be the intrinsic beauty or ugliness of the building. The second thing I'd like you to observe is the beauty or unsightliness relative to its environment. So think about this. Imagine you have a row of buildings. If you were to just blank out all the other buildings, you're observing just one building. Absolutely. And next, you're now going to observe this building relative to the other buildings, to the environment. So pay attention to its relative position in comparison to the other buildings. And the relative comparison is to try and understand as to whether the building is in place, or whether it is well placed, or whether it is out of place. So for example, you could find a building where it's a beautiful period building, and next to the building is, it's a council, a very ugly council building. Maybe next to it is another ugly modern residential tower block, and it ruins everything about the beauty of this building. So pay attention to its surrounding. Now, what I cannot do in this series or in this session is go through 800 years of British history, British architecture. I can't do that. No quantity of words would leave a vivid impression on you like a picture. What I'll try to do instead is I'm going to make references to specific words, phrases in relation to British architecture and buildings. I would like you to, at the end of this series or this session, preferably, use a search engine and search for the words that you hear, so that you can associate the features that I describe, or you can associate the particular period types of architecture that I describe with its pictorial representation. As an investor, and it's important you keep what I'm about to say in mind. This statement: buildings in Great Britain, or the buildings in Great Britain, and let me perhaps narrow that down to the area that I know very well. Buildings in London, the buildings in London that are the most beautiful and that command the most interest are predominantly period buildings. I'll say that again. In London, the buildings that are the most beautiful and command the most interest are predominantly period buildings, and therefore they make better long-term investments. Interestingly, in the London area, nostalgia is weighted heavily in property on architecture, both in London and across the UK. Now, let me start with this whole concept of period building, and let me just expand on that ever so slightly. In Great Britain, the term period architecture generally refers to buildings that are representative of a prominence. Usually it's representative of prominence of a broad architectural styles. So it's not one, it's a broad range of architectural styles. Now, although the periods converge with the reign of a special monarch, there is an overlap between periods. So you might have one period and you have an overlap, another period, and then an overlap, another period. The actual period itself has to do with the reign of a monarch, and I'm going to explain what that means. I'm sure you are aware that Great Britain, we've always had a monarchy And it's only been in the recent times that we've moved away from that monarchy system. So you have a monarchy system based on the time, but then you have an architectural style linked to that time. So although you have clarity on when a period stops, unfortunately, the architectural style doesn't just stop at the end of that period. So for example, someone else comes into power, the architectural style doesn't stop, it continues. So you have this overlap, which means that there are some buildings where you would find that there is a cross-fertilization of ideas and features. And I'm going to explain this in more detail when I give you the various periods, so do not worry too much. The point I'm trying to make is that the buildings and the architecture do not change immediately a new monarchy comes into power. Like I said, I cannot, in the short time frame, describe all of the possible features of all of the building types. Now, the building you're looking at, or the building you have an interest in, certainly will be unique. So, rather than try to describe a building that is consistent with the one you might have in mind, what I will do is I will simply list some of the items that you can use as a starting point in your inspection. Now, I realize, of course, that some of the terms I'm about to describe may not be familiar to you presently. But I'd like you to just stay along with me, like I said. My intention is that if I explain these items, if there are new words, they will become part of your vocabulary. And the more words you know, the higher the correlation with your intelligence in relation to buildings, properties, and investing. Now, let's begin. So you arrive to view a property. Step one, what do you do? I'm going to begin with what I call the building. Now, I'm going to move slightly fast, so forgive me if it seems as though I'm rushing through. You've arrived to view a building. The first thing I'd like you to make note of, remember, what we're focusing on today is what to look out for. We begin with the building. I'd like you to make, in your notepad, because you have a notepad you're using, in your notepad, make a written note of the following. Type of architecture. Now, this is where we talk about the periods and non-periods. So what type of architecture is the building? Now, here are some. Tudor, Jacobean, the Elizabethan. We have what we call the early Stuart. We have what we call William and Mary. We have what we call the Georgian, my favorite. We have what we call Regency, my second favorite. Georgian and the Regency are closely connected. As a matter of fact, Regency is simply a variation of the Georgian. It's part of the same period. But the Georgian, the traditional classical Georgian predates the Regency period. You have the Victorian, which most people are familiar with, and we have the Edwardian. Now, these are the period buildings in Great Britain. And what that means is if you're looking in terms of timeline, the timeline flows this way. Tudor, Jacobean, the Elizabethan, the early Stuarts, William and Mary, Georgian, Regency, Victorian, and Edwardian. After the Edwardian, we went into the next phase. There's a period buildings, there's a non-period buildings. You then have what we call the pre-war. This is before the war, the First World War. what we call in Great Britain the pre-war buildings. Then you have the post-war buildings. And then you have what we call modern buildings. So the first thing you're trying to understand is what type of building architecture, what type of architecture is this? Number two, what type of building? With the first, what type of architecture? The second, what type of building? By this I mean, is it a detached, semi-detached? Is it a terraced? Is it a maisonette? Is it a cottage? Is it a bungalow? Or is it a converted building? Or is it a purpose built? So for example, if it's a building in a tall, high-rise building, the architecture would be modern. The building type would be purpose-built. Number three is the construction type. Is it brick? Is it stone? Is it timber? Is it concrete? Is it steel framed? Or other? Now, I know you're probably thinking, how the hell am I supposed to know all of this when I'm not a professional? When I wasn't trained in the building profession, I'm not an architect. How can I understand all of this? The reason I'm listing all of this down is so that you can take all this information and put this, if you want to, into a spreadsheet, so that when you do your inspection, you can make notes. Or rather, you can ask questions. So you can ask the agent. You don't even have to do all this work yourself. You can ask the agent in advance, what type of architecture, what type of building, what is the construction type? And all that information can be provided to you. That is the building. That is what you're observing. So you're looking out for this. Number two, when you're done looking at the building itself, the second is then the external grounds and the boundaries. So you've looked at the building. Let's say you're looking from the side view. This is you in front of the building. The building has a front garden area and it has a rear garden. Right? The external grounds and boundaries. I'd like you to make a written note of the type and the condition of the following. Number one, boundary walls. Are there any boundary walls? Again, what you're making a note of the type and the condition. You're looking at boundary walls, fences, entrance gates, or hedges. Just make a note. Number two, the front garden, which is this. Pavement. Again, you're looking at the type of pavement. Is it stone? Is it concrete? Is it decked? The ground finish. Is it grass? Is it pavings? Is it paving stone? Is it tiled stones? Just make a note. Again, always remember that on the day you do your inspection, if you have all of this information written out, it's easy for you to make a checklist. So you're not having to memorize all of this information. What you're looking out for again also is there an absence or is there a presence of the dropped curb? So for example, in several parts of the UK, if a building has a driveway, what tends to happen is, if that's this is the pedestrianized walkway. Again, it's a public a footpath, and then this is private property, and then this is the road. Usually you have a change of level between the road and the public footpath. and the property. But if the building has a driveway, then what will happen is there will be what we call a dropped curb, where the landscape is through the council. They are the ones who do this. They will lower the slope of this so that you can drive into your building. But if the building, and once it's been done, they put a line across there, a white line, which means that people should not park in front of your house because you need access to your house. Once they've done this, we call this a dropped curb. So check and see if there's a dropped curb. Check and see if there's a driveway, if there's a garage. Check and see what the landscape looks like. Make a note of the exterior grounds and see if there's a refuse store area or a bin storage area. Number 4 is important. The presence of trees. The presence of trees and the proximity, the size of the tree in relation to the main building. You want to know if there are trees, and here's one of the big reasons. If there's a big, heavy, big tree, one of the risks would be that when the inspector, when the surveyor comes to view the house, they will consider this as a hazard, as a risk. You know, for example, if the tree was to fall, it will cause major damage to the property. Another reason is because usually trees, especially trees in the front of a building, sometimes in the rear, the roots of the trees cause damage to the drainage pipes underneath the buildings. So just make a note of presence of trees, size of the trees, the proximity to the main structure, and more importantly, once there are trees, you tend to have soil subsidence. The soil starts to, it's no longer even because of the roots. So you start to have uneven surfaces, which could affect the structure itself. The closer the tree is to the structure, the higher the risk that the movement of the soil will affect the building itself. Number 3, the building envelope. Let's start with the front. Make a written note of the type and condition of the following. Now, keep in mind that whilst you're looking at the type and the condition, you're also looking out for signs of maintenance, and you're looking out for signs that there is a need for repair. That's what we're doing with all of this work. Remember, today's focus is what to look out for, and you're trying to identify quality, damage, repairs, maintenance, quality. I said quality, and general use, wear and tear. So, in terms of the building envelope, I'll start with the first, the porch. If there's a porch, the porch will have a roof, the porch roof and floor. Entrance door. Again, you're keeping an eye for just the quality, level of maintenance. Is it in good condition? Entrance door, door frame, door lock system, windows, type of windows, window frames, overhangs, decorations. Then we come to the external wall. Again, like I mentioned before, is it brick? Is it stone? What is the mortar condition? If it's brick, generally brick buildings in the UK, in between the bricks, in order to keep the brick, you have mortar or cement in between to keep the integrity. So you're looking out for the condition of the mortar, because if the condition of the mortar is weak, then you have water ingress into the building. You're looking out for whether the brick or the stone needs replacement. You're looking out for if this mortar has been damaged so badly, then you have to undergo what we call repointing. And there's something also called tuck pointing. All of these terms I'm referring to. At the end of this session, just keep a note of all the words, and go online and search, and you can see what they look like. You have videos from various tradespeople explaining explaining their product and the service they provide. As part of the external walls, you're looking to see whether it needs to be cleaned, whether the external walls need to be redecorated or restored. You're looking out for things such as number 5, whether it has pebble dash or whether it has any form of render, paintwork, condition of the paintwork, presence of cracks on the wall, mold, presence of mold growth, or evidence of water damage. So sometimes you might have a wall and there's a pipe, a rainwater pipe that runs down the wall, and if the rainwater pipe is damaged, then all the water coming from the roof will start to ingress into the building and do damage to the structure. So you're looking out for any evidence of damage. You're also looking out for the quality of these rainwater fixtures, rainwater gutters. You're looking out for downpipes, quality of gullies and the covers, gratings, any evidence of leak. And then, of course, you're looking at the roof. You're down here. From a distance, you can see the quality of the roof. You can see the condition of the roof. You can estimate the age. So you're looking at roof tiles. Does it have slate? Is it roof slate or is it roof tiles? You're looking at condition of what we call the flashings on the roof. Say that's the chimney. Between where the chimney connects to the roof, you have what we call a flashing. You're looking out for the quality of the boards. If this is a roof where the roof comes down and meets the external wall, sometimes you have something like this. This is a fascia board, and this is a soffit board. And usually what tends to happen is this section of the fascia board is where you fix the rainwater gutters so that it connects into a pipe, and that pipe runs down the building. So the water comes into this, and you fix the gutters to the fascia board. So what you're looking for is to see the quality of this board, because if this board is weak, then this cannot do the job. So keep that in mind. Again, of course, you're looking out for the quality of the chimney. Does the chimney stack look good? You're looking at the quality of the brickwork in the chimney, flashings, cowls, and generally if there's any wood in the property. What you're looking for in addition to this is whether there have been any alterations to the existing building. So for example, if this is a side elevation of a building, side elevation, this is the front porch. Has the building been extended? Has the loft been converted? One of the key action steps when you're inspecting a property from the external, you're trying to understand whether you're looking out for presence of alterations, extensions to the original structure. You're also looking out for not just above ground, you're looking at below ground. Is there a basement that has been extended? Have they installed a basement? So keep that in mind. Now, once you've done the front and you've looked at the structure, the next thing is to come to the rear part of the building and observe the rear section, including sometimes, if it's a detached building, you might have an alleyway, a path to go from the front to the back to the rear. The rear and the side of the building are usually obscured from public view for some buildings. Therefore, in my experience, the rear part of the building and the side are the parts of the building where lower quality material is used. The front of the building is where everyone gets to see. So the quality of brick, especially on period buildings, were normally much higher. The side and the rear were the parts of the building where no one got to see. So historically, lower quality brickwork was used. So because this lower quality brickwork and lower quality finishes, say rendering, it's even more important to pay attention to those areas. In addition to that, because people don't see this, it's usually the least maintained. So you need to spend as much time, and you need to be aware of not neglecting the rear and the side during your inspection. Everything I've described so far in the front of the building is what you should do in the rear. Just make a note of what you see. But in addition, what you should look out for are the following. Let me assume this is a plan elevation of a building. That's the chimney. And this is the front of the building. This is the rear. This is the side. If there is a side, we call this an alleyway, especially if it's between two buildings. Pay attention to the alleyway and its pavement conditions. What is the quality of the flooring? Pay attention to whether there's any side gate, any fences. Pay attention to the slope of the ground. And the reason for the slope is because of surface water runoff. If it's flat, if the alleyway is flat, then what will happen is that you have ponding water. If it's not well leveled, you have pots of water. But if it's slightly on a slope, you can have the water run off to the street, and then the water is collected by the local irrigation, drainage system. This is why I made reference to something in the very early sessions, that I like to carry out my inspections during rainy days, because I can observe certain specific items, such as the quality of the rainwater gutters, drains, the quality of the rainwater collection in the property. Is there a runoff? Are there ponds? So pay attention to that. In addition to this, when you're looking at the rear, pay attention to the garden size, the landscape type, the soil type, and here's an important one: the direction that the garden is facing. Is it south facing? Is it north facing? Is it east? Is it west? Obviously, depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the world, certain parts, depending on your preferences, but also some people do not need gardens. Some people do not spend time in gardens. But it could also be that you just have an external area that you like to spend time, maybe a decked floor, maybe a place where you have a swimming pool. But pay attention to the direction that the garden is facing in relation to access to sunlight. In addition, looking at the rear of the building, you pay attention to outbuildings and structures, quality of the decking, flooring, fences. My preference, one of my favorites, is privacy levels, and whether there is any presence of any overlooking structures. I'd imagine this being your house, and this is your garden, and then imagine, there's a tall building built at the rear, and everyone in that building can look into your garden. There's no privacy. So pay attention to privacy levels. Obviously, I made reference to alterations and extensions to the original architecture. So pay attention to all of that. The key thing in closing that I would notice, that everything I've shared with you so far is the visual inspection that you need for fairly simple buildings, period buildings. However, for modern buildings or large apartment blocks, you need a different, in principle, most of what I've shared still applies, but modern buildings are built differently. And so ideally, I would list out everything you need for a modern building, but then it becomes quite technically more difficult for you, especially if you're not a building professional, because it depends on whether it's concrete. It depends on whether it's steel structure. It varies. It depends on the level of cladding. the level of glazing. So my recommendation would be, for large buildings, large apartment blocks, or multi-use buildings, I would defer detailed inspections to a professional. I would still carry out what you can using what I've shared, but recognize, for example, modern buildings don't have porches, and they may have entrance ways, but they don't have porches, and they may not have had extensions done to them. They may not have gardens like I've shared. They might have a play area, but it's well landscaped. So you can't, it's very, architecture and landscaping for modern buildings are very different for period buildings. So just keep that in mind. Now, that is all we're going to talk about today. I feel as though I've given you so much. It would be wrong of me to continue. So let me stop for today. I hope it's been useful. Again, don't try to memorize everything. Come back, rewatch, make a few notes, capture some of the words, search for those words online, watch some videos from tradespeople so you can familiarize yourself with all of these concepts. If you're carrying out an inspection, produce a spreadsheet. Put those lists, external and grounds, building envelope, front, rear, and just make a note of everything I've shared so that when you do an inspection, you can just check off what you see. And as a matter of fact, here's an exercise for you. For the next few days, as you walk down your street, or as you maybe use Google View, just get on Google View, Street View, and just go down a number of streets in Great Britain or in London, and then make observations. Look at a building and say, is that brick? Is that concrete? What is the front garden like? Does it have a drop curb? Practice makes improvements. I hope that's been useful. I wish you well.